Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Today we're going to revisit one of our favorite channels, Biographics. There you can see Simon on the screen with his epic beard and all. And today we're going to visit a topic that I'm pretty familiar with for a couple of reasons. One is because it's about a U.S. president who was a Civil War veteran, and those are two of the areas that I spend a lot of time studying is presidential history and Civil War history. He also happens to be our local president where I live. And I've got some family ties to the house he was born in. 3 of my 4 grandparents went to Niles McKinley High School. My wife went to Niles McKinley High School. So it's definitely a guy I'm very familiar with, and that anybody who lives where I live is very familiar with because he is our local president. I grew up 5 minutes from where he did. So today we're going to take a look at William McKinley, Building the American Century. As always, the link is in the description to the original content. Let's dive in. I want to give a big thank you to Prof. Moff and also to Brandon from Indian Trail, North Carolina, who are 2 of our executive producer level patrons. Thank you guys for your support.
This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. At the moment of his death, it's likely that William McKinley assumed his name would live forever. As the 25th President of the United States, McKinley had helped steer his nation out of its worst economic slump prior to the Great Depression. He'd overseen a victorious war against...
In fact, for a while, that time, like 1870s to the 1890s, was a pretty bad economic time. There was a specific economic crash in the 1870s. There's another one around 1890s. But this time was referred to as the Great Depression until the Great Depression.
European power, shepherded through the annexation of Hawaii, the purchase of the Philippines, and supervised the creation of an American empire. At home, too, he was popular, the first president to win consecutive second term in a quarter of a century. So, when he was gunned down by a terrorist in 1908...
And what he means by that is the first president to win a consecutive second term, going back to Grant. Grant was the last one to do it before him. He was elected in 1868 and 1872. There had not been... Today, back-to-back terms is kind of the norm, right? You go back, Clinton had 2 terms, Bush had 2 terms, Obama had 2 terms, Trump only had 1. That's actually out of the ordinary lately. But you had Lincoln, who was elected to 2 terms but assassinated before he could serve the second. Grant elected to 2 terms. Cleveland elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. But otherwise, in a stretch of about 70 years there, you got a lot of one-term presidents.
It must have seemed as if future generations would revere him alongside Abraham Lincoln. But of course, that's not what happened. Today, William McKinley is largely forgotten by the general public, known merely for being the guy whose death propelled VP Teddy Roosevelt to the White House, if he's remembered at all. So how did this happen? How did a man whose presidency seemed to usher in a new epoch slide so gently into oblivion? Today, Biographics is telling the story of William McKinley, the forgotten architect of the American century.
That's really true, and I'm sure they're going to get into some of this, but think about the consequential time in which McKinley is president. It's the American Empire, it's the Philippines and the Spanish American War, and it's Hawaii, and it's building the Navy to project that power at a time when other countries were doing the same thing. Look how young he was there.
Given how anonymous he is today, it's fitting that William McKinley's early life was so marvelously obscure. Born on January the 29th, 1843 in the small town of Niles, Ohio,
I actually have this map. It's from the 1880s. I have it in this room somewhere here. This is really cool because you can really see what Niles looked like at this time. My grandparents grew up on Langley Street, which is right here. This area right here eventually will become known as Niles Fire Brick Company. And today Niles has a huge population of people with Kentucky roots, and that's because of Niles Fire Brick. They recruited hundreds of workers from the town of Olive Hill, Kentucky, this little town in eastern Kentucky, to come up and work at Niles Fire Brick. And so to this day, there are more people in Niles from Olive Hill than live in Olive Hill, Kentucky. But McKinley grows up right here on what is now Main Street. His house that he was born in is like right here. In fact, I want to show you a little bit of Niles because they actually just rebuilt his birthplace. All right, so a little bit of a geography lesson about me in particular. I grew up right on this street, Route 46 in Mineral Ridge, this little town right there. I live in Austin Town now, which is right there. And then here's Niles right here. So that image that we're looking at in the video is actually looking from kind of the southwest toward Niles. But right here is Main Street going across the Mahoning River. The Mahoning River is kind of the reason that Youngstown and Niles and other industrial centers kind of sprouted up in this part of Ohio because of access to the Mahoning River, which eventually makes its way down into, I think, the Beaver River, which then eventually makes its way into the Ohio River, which goes into the Mississippi. But anyway, zooming in here, this is Main Street. And then McKinley's home that he was born in is right here. It was built by the brother of my fifth great grandfather. But I want to show you kind of the ground level and tell you a little bit of how this house kind of came about, because it wasn't here until about 10, 15 years ago. There was a bank right here with a drive-through that had been built on the site. The original house that McKinley was born in got moved at some point in the 19th century to a park. And then it got moved again, I think, and then it burned down in a fire. So it was lost. So when the opportunity presented itself 10, 15 years ago, they tore down that old bank right there and rebuilt from what we know of how McKinley's house looked like. They rebuilt it here, and you can actually go in and do tours and things like that on the actual site where it was. Now, I grew up a lot going to the McKinley Library, which is right here, that was built in the aftermath of his assassination. Pretty close to the site where he was born, but not exactly on the site where he was born. In pre-internet times, this was our local library for me growing up.
William grew up the seventh of 8 children, doing all the things that boys did for fun in the mid-19th century: swimming, hunting, and learning to ride a horse.
And I should say, too, that there are members of the McKinley family, including, I believe, a young sister of President McKinley, who are still buried in Niles. It's just off. You can't see it on this particular image, but if you went up Vienna right here, you would come to what is known today as the Niles City Cemetery. And the oldest section of that cemetery, I have dozens and dozens of family members in that cemetery, but the oldest section of that cemetery is where some of the McKinley family is buried.
Boys did for fun in the mid-19th century: swimming, hunting, and learning to ride a horse. His parents, too, were utterly ordinary. His mother a devout Christian, while his father ran a small foundry. It wasn't enough to make them rich, but it was enough to make them live without worry. Average as they were, though, there were 2 things that marked out the boys' parents as unusual. One was a ferocious belief in the value of education. Although they were happy in Niles, Mr. and Mrs. McKinley hated the idea of their kids growing up semi-educated ignoramuses. When William was just 10, they moved to the town of Poland just so that he could attend private school. But it was...
So they moved to Poland, but it's important to note, not the country Poland, okay? Let me show you again. We'll go to the map. So backing out here a little bit now, you see Niles right here, and you follow the Mahoning River down from Niles, and you get into Youngstown, and just on the other side of Youngstown is Poland Township. My kids played them in sports, play Poland. When what's known as the Connecticut Western Reserve was laid out, before Ohio existed, this whole part of Northeast Ohio was known as the Connecticut Western Reserve. And so a lot of Connecticut names here. I grew up in Trumbull County, which is named after Governor Trumbull of Connecticut. I grew up in Wethersfield Township, which is where Niles is. It's in Wethersfield Township, again, named after a Connecticut area. But they were laid out in ranges and townships, and they're all equal size. And Town 1, Range 1 was Poland Township, all the way down in the corner. So, right here.
The second notable thing about his family that would have the biggest impact. Both Mum and Pop were ardent abolitionists. This was a time when many in the North campaigned against slavery's expansion, but stopped short of wanting to outlaw it in the South. The McKinleys, by contrast, drilled into their children that slavery was evil, that it was worth putting your life on the line to help eradicate it.
And it's important to highlight that, because a lot of times we try to give people who were white supremacists by today's standards, or people who were pro-slavery, a pass because we say, well, that's how most people felt at the time. But the fact is, there were a lot of ardent abolitionists like the McKinley family, like the Grant family, who believed, even in a time when most people didn't, in the idea of freedom for 4 million slaves.
Those beliefs would soon have a profound effect on young William's future. In 1860, a combination of illness and financial troubles forced 16-year-old McKinley to leave his college and return home, taking up work as a postal clerk to make ends meet.
And where he was going to college was Allegheny College, which is just across the border up in, I think, Meadville, Pennsylvania, which is maybe an hour and a half away from here, driving. So yeah, he didn't quite finish his education then and enlists, I think, as a private in the Civil War.
Barely had he settled into this role when news reached Ohio that a South Carolina militia had bombarded Fort Sumter, kick-starting the Civil War. Within weeks, McKinley had signed up, joining the Ohio 23rd Regiment, determined to do his duty, a duty that he'd carry out with jaw-dropping zeal. As a private,
and the 23rd Ohio was eventually commanded by Rutherford B. Hayes, 2 presidents in a single regiment. Pretty cool stuff.
But McKinley was almost suicidally brave, gaining a reputation for riding through dense cannon fire to deliver urgent messages. He served at Antietam, still regarded as the bloodiest single day in U.S. history, where he charged through heavy enemy fire to deliver supplies to Union troops.
Specifically, he was the commissary sergeant. He was getting food to these troops. And there's a huge monument. In fact, I did a video about it. I'll throw up a link at the end. At the Antietam battlefield, a huge monument that was placed to McKinley, to a guy known as Coffee Bill, because he would bring coffee to the soldiers. But he gets a commission after that.
It was antics like these that brought him to the attention of his commander, Rutherford B. Hayes. 20 years older than McKinley, Hayes regarded all his men as family, treating them with a respect that was legendary. But he seemed to have a special affection for the young man from Niles. After Antietam, he placed McKinley on his general staff. By the time the war was over, he seemed to consider the lad an honorary son. For his part, McKinley returned home with the rank of brevet major. For the rest of his life, those closest to him would refer to him affectionately as the Major. Yet while he might have returned to civilian life, McKinley wouldn't go back to his pre-war job. Back in Ohio, the young man opens a law practice in Canton, becoming locally successful.
And Canton, there's a Canton McKinley High School also, because he would spend most of his adult life in Canton. It's where he's elected governor from. It's where he's elected to Congress from. It's where he's elected as president from. And that's where he's buried today.
The real change would come courtesy of his new mentor. In 1867, Rutherford Hayes came to McKinley and basically said, "Young man, I've decided to run for governor. Fancy doing my dirty work?" Stumping for Hayes that year was McKinley's first brush with politics, and evidently he liked what he saw.
This was a time in history when most people didn't campaign for themselves. It was kind of seen as beneath the candidate to do that, and so a lot of times they do like these front porch campaigns where they'd kind of do stuff from home, but they didn't travel around and campaign. They had people do that for them. McKinley does that for Hayes. Mark Hanna will do that for McKinley.
After Hayes won, the younger man threw himself into Republican politics. In 1869, he was elected prosecuting attorney of Stark County, and while that might seem like a minor post to start with, it really was just the start. Now he'd gotten a taste of it, McKinley wouldn't be content to just sit around with his thumb up his bottom in Stark County. Oh no. Instead, he was going to take that butt and that soiled thumb all the way to Washington. Since no one actually asked him, we can't say for certain, but it seems likely that McKinley would have regarded 1869 as the greatest year of his life. That's because 1869 wasn't just the year he moved into politics, but also the year he met Ida Saxton. Highly educated and extremely progressive on rights for women and African Americans, Ida was everything McKinley dreamed of in a partner. The pair met at a picnic that summer. By January 1871, they'd married. Just 11 months later, on Christmas Day, their daughter Catherine was born. Not long after.
And unfortunately, it's one of the sad aspects of McKinley's story is that not only did none of his children survive to adulthood, but his wife was really, really frail and dealt with some severe health issues for most of their married life.
After, in 1873, their second daughter followed. But if 1869 was the highlight of McKinley's life, 1873 would represent the blackest depths. Just 4 months after being born, their youngest daughter died. Around the same time, Ida's mother passed away, and the combined tragedy seems to have broken her. For the rest of her life, Ida would be crippled with depression that only got worse when their daughter Catherine likewise died in 1875. Combined with a sudden onset of epilepsy, the mental breakdown helped turn her into an invalid, someone in need of long-term care.
And this says a lot about McKinley, that he managed to balance being in the highest levels of government, an influential congressman, an Ohio governor, and president, but also seemed to have really given a lot of attention to caring for his wife.
And care for her, William McKinley would. Throughout the rest of his story, even as his star rises, even as he becomes president, McKinley's number one concern will always be Ida. For some members of the public, this was scandalous. For others, admirable. But it's unlikely the future president gave a damn either way. For 4 short years, he and Ida enjoyed a perfect life. In return, he would now stand by her until the bitter end. Not that his extra duties as carer would get in the way of McKinley's rise. The same year his mentor, Rutherford Hayes, decided to run for the White House, McKinley ran for his own seat in Congress. So loyal was he to the older man, though, that he took time off from his own campaign to stump for him. Evidently, it didn't do any harm. That November...
And as I mentioned earlier about the fact that people didn't typically campaign for themselves at this time, it was a great way to get your own name out to run on behalf of other people, right? So campaigning for Hayes puts McKinley at the forefront and gets him his own positions in government. And then the same thing will happen with Mark Hanna when Mark Hanna, who's also a Northeast Ohio guy, is from Lisbon, when Mark Hanna campaigns for McKinley and then gets his own seat in the Ohio Senate.
McKinley won a seat in the House of Representatives.
I should say a U.S. Senator from Ohio.
Would hold, bar a brief period following the 1882 election, for 14 years. In a whimsical little twist, McKinley celebrated his win by sticking a scarlet carnation in his lapel, a fashion choice that he kept up for the rest of his career. It would be thanks to this that Ohio adopted the carnation as its state flower in 1904. But while
and scarlet and gray are the colors of Ohio State.
McKinley had deftly won his congressional run, the same couldn't be said for Hayes. The 1876 election was the tightest in history, with just a handful of contested electoral votes separating Hayes from his Democratic opponents. After a bitter political fight, the Democrats agreed to drop their claim to those all-important votes in return for President Hayes ending Reconstruction. For a supporter of African American rights, this was likely a nasty blow to McKinley. Not that he was brave enough to show it, though.
Now, and I've said this before, I think this whole thing about the corrupt agreement that Hayes makes to get the White House over Samuel Tilden is a little bit overblown, because the political winds had shifted sharply against Reconstruction by 1876. Reconstruction did not look in 1876 the way it did in, say, 1870. A lot of the power behind it had already dissipated. And if Tilden had been elected as a Democrat to the White House, he also was going to end Reconstruction. Reconstruction was done either way. And that's unfortunate because of what it led to for 100 years or more in the South for African Americans. But the fact is, it really didn't change all that much.
Throughout his time in Washington, McKinley would remain on Hayes' good side, and in return, the president would help propel his career ever higher. By 1889, that included reaching the heights of chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, from where McKinley was able to pursue his pet project, tariffs.
Ways and Means Committee, one of the most powerful positions you can have in the government at that time, and even to this day in the House.
Era, the Republican Party was broadly against free trade, preferring instead a form of protectionism to help boost American manufacturers. McKinley was all in on this, believing aggressive trade policies would help improve the lives of ordinary people. So much so that in 1890 he used his position to push through something known as the McKinley Tariff. Slapping import taxes on over 1,500 goods, McKinley confidently expected the act to raise prosperity for manufacturers, which it absolutely did. Unfortunately, it also sent consumer prices skyrocketing. The hike on goods was so eye-watering that it effectively dynamited the Congressional Republican Party. By the 1890 midterms, voters were so angry that the GOP lost 93 seats and control of the House.
And the Republicans had dominated politics since Lincoln's election in 1860. With a few minor exceptions in there. For the most part, they dominated for a good 60 years. And this is also a shift in the Republican Party to where, even to this day, a lot of people identify the Republicans with big business and the wealthy and things like that. And this is really where that starts, is with McKinley.
Among those swept out of office was William McKinley. Stung, hurt, McKinley slunk back to Ohio to run for governor. Although he won, it was hardly a resounding success. McKinley's margin of victory was barely a polling error. But politics is a winner-takes-all game, and whether voters were enthusiastic for him or not, McKinley was now the governor of the Buckeye State. It would be in this new role that he'd soon meet the man who'd make him president.
Mark Hanna.
Mark Hanna occupies a strange, shifting place in McKinley's story. In the early 20th century, the wealthy Ohioan was often cast in the role of puppet master, the guy who made McKinley president to push his own pet policies. Today, though, a more common view has it that McKinley used Hanna more than Hanna used him, leveraging his patron's wealth to pursue independent goals. Whatever the truth, there's no doubt their meeting while McKinley was governor set both men on the path back to Washington, but only after fate gave a little bit of a helping hand. In 1893, the same year that Rutherford Hayes went off to the Great Ohio in the Sky, Democrat Grover Cleveland began his second non-consecutive...
The Great Ohio in the Sky. That might be one of the coolest things I've ever heard. Going off to the Great Ohio in the Sky. Very cool.
Term in the White House. Unfortunately for his party, no sooner had he started than America was walloped by one of the worst depressions in history. Yep. The Panic of 1893 collapsed the economy. Unemployment jumped to 19%. Scores of banks and railroads failed. Savings were wiped out. Investors lost everything. Among those nearly destroyed was McKinley, who'd foolishly co-signed a $100,000 bank loan for a friend. When the friend went bust, McKinley was left on the hook for the money. Luckily, the uber-wealthy Mark Hanna stepped in to bail him out, and that left McKinley perfectly poised to reap the Depression's bitter rewards. With the economy in freefall, the electorate gave the Democrats a shellacking.
It's the economy, stupid. That was a saying in the 1990s during one of the elections. And, the economy is always, whether it's controlled by the president or not, the guy at the top is going to get the blame and get the credit, depending on how the economy goes.
94 midterms remained the worst defeat of any party in an off-presidential election year. What the Republicans had suffered in 1890, the Democrats were now suffering 10 times over. And that meant 1896 was now looking like an assured GOP victory. All McKinley had to do was make sure that his name was on the ticket. By now,
if anybody, if you're not familiar with that term GOP, which is used for the Republicans, it means Grand Old Party. It was just a nickname they had.
McKinley was a known quantity, having chaired the Republican National Convention and governed Ohio for years. But rather than take his chances, he was determined to make sure he was the delegate's only choice. Backed by Hanna's money and spin operation, McKinley ran perhaps the first recognizably modern nomination campaign in history, one marked by some interesting firsts. Perhaps the biggest was his decision to speak to 2 all-black audiences while campaigning, the first white candidate to ever do so. Yet, it would be in the presidential campaign itself that McKinley really redefined what American politics could be. Given the nomination that summer with Garrett Hobart as his VP pick, McKinley launched what was then the largest election campaign the nation had ever seen. Backed by a war chest of $4 million, the Republican Party flooded swing states with political leaflets, mailings, pins, badges, you name it.
And a lot of this, I shouldn't say a lot of it, but there was a significant amount of money who came from some of those early, very wealthy men, the John D. Rockefellers of the world. Rockefeller's another Northeast Ohio guy. And they saw an opportunity to get behind McKinley and maybe get some influence there in the process.
Anything to keep their candidate's name in people's minds. McKinley himself, meanwhile, took the old-fashioned front porch campaign to a whole new level. In the months leading up to November, he invited a total of 750,000 people to hear him speak, and not just in any old order. Across 350 speeches, McKinley tailored his pitch to different groups. To the traditional Republican WASPs, but also to Jews, to Catholics, to black people, to emigres from Portugal, Bohemia, Germany, you name it. After decades in which the two parties had come to rely on their bases, McKinley was trying to build a big tent coalition, one that included as many traditional Democratic voters as possible. For their part, the Democrats put up the populist firebrand William Jennings Bryan, but while he had energy...
Who would be the Democratic nominee 3 times and who would lose 3 times. And the interesting thing about this particular election is that both of these men were deeply religious men. They actually had a lot in common in terms of their personal lives, both deeply religious Christians, but very different philosophy when it came to government.
Bryan was playing an old game, preaching to the choir, even as McKinley was luring them away to his exciting new chancel. That November, the results were unambiguous. McKinley beat Bryan by a margin of 600,000 in the popular vote and nearly 100 in the Electoral College. For those of us alive today, used to reading about Ronald Reagan's 1980 landslide or FDR crushing it in 1932, McKinley's victory might seem unspectacular, but make no mistake, in 1896 it was a political earthquake. For the first time since Ulysses S. Grant was re-elected a quarter century earlier, a candidate had won over 50% of the popular vote. The era of extremely narrow victories was over. McKinley...
Think about that. For the first time in a quarter century, a candidate gets more than 50% of the vote. It actually did not happen all that often. And to this day, we still have that. I mean, Lincoln got, like 42%? Bill Clinton only got a little over 40% when he won. Not all elections are like a mandate, are a majority of people. Sometimes it's just a plurality. You got more votes than everybody else.
Had just won the most convincing mandate in a generation. And he would use that to completely upend politics. In one specific way, the election of William McKinley sparked the end of an era. Upon his inauguration, the 25th president became the fifth and last Civil War veteran to reach the highest office. Perhaps fitting.
So, Civil War veterans who were president, obviously Grant, Benjamin Harrison, Rutherford B. Hayes, William McKinley was one. And so was, let's see here, who are we missing in all of that? James Garfield. All Republicans, all from Ohio. Yeah, right. Hayes, Harrison, McKinley, Grant, all from Ohio, and Garfield. I believe, I mean, if we're talking about veterans, we're talking about men who actually served on the front lines, right? So guys like... who am I thinking of here? Guys like Grover Cleveland. I think he had some kind of a commission, but didn't actually serve like in combat.
His time in the White House would be dominated by conflict. But this time, the fighting would be taking place on American soil, but in the last remaining outposts of the Spanish Empire. Back in 1895, when McKinley was still just governor of Ohio, the people of Cuba had risen in revolt against Madrid, to which Madrid had responded by herding 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps, an insane overreaction that had done for Spain's reputation what the Newsnight interview did for Prince Andrews. By the time McKinley became commander-in-chief, the American public and press were demanding some form of intervention.
What he just said there is so key, the public and the press. The press played a huge role in propelling the United States into war with Spain. So much so that it perpetuated some really fabricated untruths that became the basis for the war, mainly the explosion of the USS Maine.
At first, the new president kept things diplomatic. By gently applying pressure to Madrid, McKinley got the Spaniards to grudgingly release the camp prisoners and grant Cuba limited authority. This even led Washington sending the battleship Maine to Havana as a show of friendship. But then the 15th of February 1898 rolled around and everything went to hell. That day, a mysterious explosion destroyed the Maine in harbor, killing 226 crewmen. In the aftermath, a tsunami of anger washed over America. Before an investigation could be concluded, the press was whipping up further for war with Madrid. Not so long ago, historians believed that McKinley allowed this fervor to carry him along, dragging him into the war before he knew all of the facts, the Iraq War of the late 19th century. But newer scholarship disputes this version. In modern tellings, McKinley did all he humanly could to avoid war until it became necessary, desperately keeping diplomatic channels open until Spain angrily cut all contact. Whichever version is true, the outcome was absolutely the same.
So what probably happened with the Maine, what it was blamed on was a mine in the harbor, but it was actually probably an internal explosion that caused it.
3rd of April, Madrid declared war. 2 days later, Washington did the same, the first time America had declared war on a European power since 1812. Yet, while the War of 1812 would result in a messy draw, the Spanish-American War would have a much clearer outcome. By that, we mean the United States absolutely crushed Madrid. Within days, Spain's Pacific Fleet had been destroyed in the Philippines. Not long after, the Atlantic Fleet was sunk near Jamaica, and American troops were marching on Puerto Rico. Cuba itself, former Assistant Secretary of the Navy Teddy Roosevelt victoriously led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill, with Santiago falling not long after. By the 12th of August, Spain had been defeated, and the war was over. A war in which McKinley had played a vital role, using newly installed telephones to talk to his generals in real time. Yet it wasn't the war itself that so shaped McKinley's presidency, but what came after. From the ashes of Spain's defeat, the 25th president helped build a true American empire. At the height of the fighting in July, McKinley had already signed an order officially annexing Hawaii.
So think about this for a second. Most of America's early history, the first 100 years or so, is defined by two things, right? Slavery and manifest destiny. This idea, manifest destiny, that the U.S. was destined to control everything from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Manifest destiny's been completed. The U.S. controls everything that the modern map shows today on the continent. So what's next? Well, now we're looking to the idea of colonies, right? Well, the European powers have gathered up most of those colonies already, so you're going to have to take them from them. So this war with Spain became an opportunity to get a base in Cuba, to solidify what was happening with Hawaii in 1898 being annexed, which gave us a Pacific base, and then eventually spreading over to the Philippines.
With Madrid defeated, he oversaw a peace treaty that expanded Washington's holdings further still. Under the terms thrashed out, Puerto Rico and Guam became American possessions, and Cuba was nominally granted independence, but in reality was likewise drawn into Washington's orbit. But the biggest change was the purchase of the Philippines. For $20 million, Madrid signed over its Great Pacific Outpost. With that purchase, the US became a true colonial power. McKinley personally pushed hard for this, convincing the Senate to ratify the treaty with a two-thirds majority,
And this was not the first time the U.S. had attempted to do this. Grant, during his presidency, 1869 to 1877, had an agreement in place in which the U.S. was going to annex what was known as Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic. But he couldn't get the Senate on board to ratify it, so it didn't happen.
The House to appropriate millions for empire building. It was a hugely divisive decision, one which saw guys like Mark Twain eviscerate the president for wanting to emulate the corrupt empires of Europe. But Twain was in the minority. Enthusiastically backed by Teddy Roosevelt, McKinley embraced America's new role in the world, a role that would make it one of the world's great powers, a role that would also involve some very murky moral compromises. Just as it's hard to make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, so too is it hard to build an empire without breaking a whole lot of humans. In the case of the American Empire, most of that breaking came during the Philippine American War. Having been freed from Spanish rule, a lot of Filipinos believed, not unreasonably, that their islands should belong to them. So when Uncle Sam instead rolled up and started draping everything in star-spangled banners, they tried their best to fight back.
And remember, this is a time before the idea of self-determination and people being able to rule themselves is really taking hold, which it will in another generation after the First World War. This is a time when this is what great powers did. It doesn't excuse it, but the U.S. is not acting any different than a lot of other powers, but it does. It gets really, really ugly.
The result? McKinley sends in an American occupation force, one that met the rebels with brutal violence. By the time the war ended in 1902, it's estimated some 200,000 Filipinos had died. Many of the tactics that had so outraged Americans when used by Spain on Cuba were now turned on the Philippines with predictably awful results. Yet the Philippines wasn't McKinley's only post-war foreign adventure. In 1900, he committed troops without congressional approval to the Eight-Nation Alliance sent to put down China's Boxer Rebellion. It was a move that won the US a $25 million payout from China's post-invasion indemnity, while also confirming it as a nation newly willing to flex its muscle on the world stage. This is one of the reasons some call McKinley the architect of the American century.
Yeah, that's true. And, this is not the only time the U.S. does this. They're going to be involved in Haiti in the years leading up to the First World War involvement. They're going to be involved in Mexico in those years. You look at some of the men who served in World War I, like in the Marines, and these were guys who had received medals of honor for actions in Mexico or in Haiti or in the Philippines.
just because he helped guide the country out of the 1890s depression and into prosperity, but because he set the blueprints for Washington's foreign interventionist policy. This was a policy that would echo through World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, and beyond. Still, we don't want to paint his presidency as one entirely predicated on foreign policy. Even with the conflagration that was engulfing the Philippines, McKinley was likewise changing things back home. Perhaps his most notable achievement was to concentrate power back in the hands of the president. Following the Civil War, the US had gone through an era when real power seemed to lie with Congress. Now McKinley embarked on a great centralizing drive, making the White House once again the first among co-equal branches, paving the way for the extremely active presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson that would follow.
Yeah, remember that Lincoln really kind of pushed forward a lot of executive power in order to win the American Civil War, and so there was a pushback on that by Congress in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, it's arguable that McKinley's most impactful domestic decision didn't involve, once again, raising tariffs or his laudable hiring of African Americans into diplomatic positions, but simply giving Roosevelt a job. Back in 1896, the younger man had campaigned heartily for McKinley, so much so that advisors wondered if the new president shouldn't reward him. Personally, McKinley didn't like the idea at all. He thought Roosevelt was too pugnacious, too unwilling to compromise. But he also recognized that Teddy had a sharp mind and was genuinely talented. So he decided to take a gamble on him, making him Assistant Secretary of the Navy. That allowed Roosevelt to have a high-profile position to resign from when war broke out, allowed him to become a famous hero at the head of the Rough Riders, and return to Republican politics as one of the hottest properties. Yet this would still have been for naught, and McKinley not taken a second chance. On the 21st of November 1899, McKinley's original VP, Garrett Hobart, died in office. With no 25th Amendment, the position remained open until the 1900 Republican Convention, by which time Teddy was the favorite to join McKinley.
Yeah, so that's a great point, is that there is no... A lot of the things we take for granted today, things like the line of succession, those are much more modern developments, right? So when John Tyler becomes president on the death of the president, all the way back decades before this, there was no automatic assumption that, oh yeah, John Tyler's the president now and he will fill out the rest of the term. That was all stuff that kind of got developed and was not necessarily understood the same way it is today. When the vice president died, and this happened quite a few times where a vice president died in office, there was no means through which to fill that void until we get up right before it actually gets used. The 25th Amendment, where you're going to see in the 1970s a vice president resign and then get replaced by Gerald Ford, who's then going to become president when the president resigns. None of that was in place at this time.
McKinley's ticket. Behind the scenes, though, McKinley's old patron, Mark Hanna, was unhappy. Like the president, he despised Teddy's macho style. In meetings, he impressed upon McKinley the need to find someone else. Anyone else. But McKinley knew talent when he saw it. Putting his personal feelings aside, he threw his weight behind the war hero for his VP pick. And
at this time, Roosevelt is the governor of New York.
On decision, the 25th president changed the course of American history. The 1900 election played out like a Disney live-action remake of 1896 that absolutely nobody needed to see. Once again, the Democrats put up William Jennings Bryan. Once again, McKinley trounced him, becoming the first president to be elected for a second consecutive term since Ulysses S. Grant. This time, however, the epilogue would be completely different. Recently, the administration had noticed McKinley receiving an alarming number of death threats. In this era, there was no dedicated Secret Service detail to provide security, just personal bodyguards who tried to urge the president to be more careful around the public. Unfortunately, this was also
quite amazing when you consider that in the span of 36 years, there are 3 presidential assassinations. It's after this third one that they'll finally get it, and they'll finally have a permanent Secret Service detail for the president.
Also an era in which presidents were expected to be approachable, regularly seen chatting to citizens in the street. When McKinley's bodyguards asked him to be less conspicuous, he was basically like, absurd! What America would ever want to harm their president? To which the answer would soon turn out to be Leon Czolgosz. An unemployed Detroit mill worker with anarchist leanings, Czolgosz had gotten it into his head that McKinley was oppressing the working man and needed to be stopped.
Leave it to a guy from Michigan to assassinate a president from Ohio. Just saying.
And since this was the great era of anarchist assassinations, Czolgosz didn't plan to stop McKinley via the ballot box. That September 1901, Czolgosz traveled to Buffalo, where McKinley was speaking at the Pan American Exposition. On September the 6th, the president stood outside the Temple of Music to shake hands with passers-by.
And the next building over is where Robert Todd Lincoln is. Robert Todd Lincoln, the only surviving son of the four sons of Abraham Lincoln, who was in Washington when his father was assassinated, who was at the train station with Garfield. He was in Garfield's cabinet when Garfield was assassinated, and was the next building over when McKinley was assassinated.
Despite his bodyguards trying to get him to cut things short, McKinley insisted on continuing his greetings. At 16:07, the 25th president turned and held out his hand to the next man. Czolgosz took it, and with his free hand he fired 2 bullets into McKinley's stomach. The pandemonium that followed was bizarre in that, unlike JFK or Lincoln, McKinley remained conscious as it all unfolded. From his wounded position, he begged the angry crowd not to lynch Czolgosz, before turning to his private secretary, a guy called Cortelyou, saying, "My wife, be careful, Cortelyou, how you tell her."
His first thought was the fragility of his wife and his concern for her. McKinley and Garfield 100% would have survived their wounds if they were killed today. Those were both survivable wounds, but with the medicine of the time, even Garfield, with the medicine of the time, probably should have survived. McKinley, infection.
Oh, be careful. In an odd way, it's touching to see how he remained so concerned about Ida to the very end. Not that everyone realized this was really the end. Rushed to hospital, McKinley was declared badly wounded, but likely to survive. Transferred to the nearby home of the exhibition's organizer, he began to recuperate. For several days, it looked like he'd pull through. And then the great horror of the pre-antibiotics world reared its head. Gangrene. The infection that took hold around the wound did what Czolgosz's bullets had failed to do. On the 14th of September 1901, William McKinley died in Buffalo, the third president to be assassinated. He was 58. The reaction to McKinley's death varied wildly by person. On vacation, Teddy Roosevelt found himself forced to hightail it to New York to take the oath of office. Mark Hanna, meanwhile, was seemingly more concerned about Roosevelt's election, snarling, "I told William McKinley it was a mistake to nominate this man in Philadelphia. I asked him if he realized what would happen if he should die. Now look, that damn cowboy is President of the United States." For his part, Leon Czolgosz never showed any remorse. He was executed on October the 29th of that year, his infamy assured.
And if you see video that purports to be of Czolgosz's execution in the electric chair, it's not. It's a recreation that shows what it would have looked like when he was electrocuted, but it isn't actually him.
Mostly, though, the death of McKinley was marked by an outpouring of grief, one so vast it's comparable to the aftermath of JFK's assassination, one that made it seem like his name would live on forever. Instead, it was destined to slip into oblivion. Today, William McKinley sits alongside guys like William Taft and Calvin Coolidge in the special category of significant presidents most people have somehow forgotten about.
So let me show you something real quick, because I've been to the site where McKinley was assassinated. It's a very kind of nondescript location today. So it's up here on the north side of Buffalo, New York, if you go there, and it's in a residential neighborhood. It's like, seriously, like if you look around, there's just houses, and it's on this little like kind of median in the middle of the street with houses on either side, and it's just this little marker that shows you that this is the site of what was the Temple of Music where McKinley was assassinated. It's really crazy.
Despite overseeing a successful war and dying tragically, there remain few monuments to him. Even Mount McKinley in Alaska was officially renamed Denali by the Obama administration in 2016, and so McKinley's great slide into anonymity continues. And in many ways, it's a pity. Although he wasn't perfect, McKinley oversaw a profound transformation in American history, a moment when the US went from being a regional power to a great power, was sitting atop a global empire.
Yeah.
Without his lead, the expansionist presidency of Teddy Roosevelt would have been unthinkable. Take Teddy out of the equation, and you also have no presidents, Taft or Wilson, and suddenly American history starts to look really rather different. Yet McKinley was more than just a prelude to TDR. In his unshowy way, he changed what the presidency could be, changed what America was, how Americans thought about themselves and their place in the world. He may still be obscure today, but we are all still very much living in a future that McKinley helped create.
100% agree. One of the most consequential presidencies in history, whether you agree with the choices he made or not, whether you like the direction it took the country or not, you have to acknowledge he took the country in a very specific direction that was defined in the 20th century. So big thank you to Seth. Sorry I don't have an address for you, Seth, but also Jonathan in Oakley, California. I appreciate your support on Patreon. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.